start with this hand from the 25k single day high roller. So we're under the gun six-handed or low jack here, 60 big blinds deep, and I open ace four of clubs, and small blind, who is a very good loose and aggressive regular, calls me, and we go heads up to the flop. And then on king 9-9 rainbow, we do not have a backdoor flush draw. I'm assuming my opponent is checking range here, and I decide to check back here. So first, let's talk about what my assumptions are for this particular opponent. Like I said, on the loose and more aggressive side, so I expect that he is pretty much never slow playing pre-flop. So he won't have aces, won't have kings, won't have ace king, since he'll just use his aggressive image to be able to 3-bet all of those hands for value. But because he's loose, I think we might run into a 9 a little bit more often than one might expect in these positions. So I'd expect them to peel pre-flop with stuff like 9-8 suited, ace-9 suited, king-9 suited at a very, very high frequency. And so what does that mean when we see this sort of board? Well, it means that a lot of our range, while we have a general nuttiness and equity advantage on this sort of board, a lot of our good hands with good equity can't actually get 3 streets of value here. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be checking a lot. In fact, if we look at this board and how it should be played in theory, we'll see that if it's not a pure bet, it's going to be almost a pure bet in this sort of spot, just because we do have a nuttiness and an equity advantage here from the low jack against the small blind flatting range. However, because of the way the board works, we don't get to go 3 streets for value with a lot of our range, and the stuff that does have good equity but can't go 3 streets doesn't need a lot of protection because it's a king high board. So there's just not that many bad cards that can come out that will hurt us. And so because of that, I decided that I would get a little bit tricky here, and I opted to check back. Now it's important to mention that I'm not super deviating here from optimal play. I think that we can check this board. I think there are other boards, such as more Broadway boards where, for example, we opened an early position and the big blind defended, where we just make so much money by c-betting any 2 cards that we must do so. But in this sort of spot where we do run into a 9 sometimes, and otherwise when we have a king, we're not that incentivized to put money into the pot right away, it's okay to start developing a wider check back range than is optimal as an exploit. And so what exactly am I exploiting here? Well, my assumption is that opponents will be, generally speaking, more likely to overfold against a delay c-bet than they are against a flop c-bet. And the reason that I think it's true is because generally people are somewhat aware how often they're supposed to defend against a flop c-bet because it happens so often, and it's sort of easy to tell where you are in your range and how often you should be defending on the flop. But once you check back in a spot where you're not really supposed to be checking back all that often, and you take your opponent out of a common spot, generally what people start doing is they start putting you on specific hands. And so what are the specific hands that people are likely to put me on if I check back in a spot like this? Well, queens come to mind, jacks come to mind, maybe a hand like king 8 suited, maybe king 10 suited comes to mind. Maybe ace queen could check back, but generally stronger stuff, not nuttier stuff, but stronger, overall a stronger range against weaker hands than I would be potentially c-betting on the flop. And so what I think that accomplishes is that when we get to the turn and we face another check from our opponent, we'll get a lot of overfolding, and our delay c-bet success will be a lot higher than our flop c-bet success. And so when we get to the turn is as bad as it could be for our hand. It doesn't improve our hand at all, and now there's a flush draw that we don't have or don't block. But I elect to bet anyway. And in this sort of spot, I think that in contrast to the flop, we are getting a lot more folds than we should be. So exploitatively, I'm very, very comfortable with this bet because, like I said, I think that my opponent's very likely to put me on some sort of pot control-y hand that decided to check back the flop and now might easily fold a pocket pair like 6s or 7s or 8s, or might fold a hand like ace queen or ace jack, which would have had a lot more difficulty folding on the flop. And then so our bet gets called, we go to the river, and the river is another blank. And I think at this point I have somewhat of a mandatory bluff. I don't block the flush draw. I lose to some of the flush draws that my opponent can have. I still get a fold from a hand like 10s or jacks, which will think that they're blocking all of my bluffs and that are losing to any of my pot control delay c-bets for value. And I think the 6s, 7s, or 5s that got sticky on the turn are very, very likely to pure fold this river, which, unless my opponent is for some reason check calling and checking 9x to me at a very high frequency, or just not betting a king himself ever on the turn, what that will mean is that my opponent will be very much overfolding to this river bet. And you can see I wouldn't say I sized down, but I elected to not go for the overbet, since in this sort of spot, it's a lot harder to defend against 15 into 23 than against, let's say, 35 into 23. Because if I overbet, if my opponent chooses the strategy of calling me with a king and folding everything else, there's really not that much. It's going to be a mistake, but it's not going to be a huge mistake. But if my opponent just folds every pair that's not a king to this size of bet, then our bluff success is much, much higher than it should be. And so very fortunately, the exploit did work. I got a very long tank on the river and eventually got a fold, and was very happy with how the hand turned out. And so now I want to take a look at this hand in PIO Solver just to see what the computer does in this sort of spot and to see if the projected deviations of my opponent actually warrant the exploit that I took. All right, so pre-flop ranges. This would be my opening range from low jack at a tough, aggressive table. And the small blind range is a little bit more interesting to talk about since it's, more subjective and people play the spot very different. For this particular player, I assumed that we'd be seeing a pretty polarized 3-betting strategy. And so for value, we'd be seeing queens plus ace king, some jacks, some ace queen, and most of the bluffs I assume it would be drawn from ace x suited, and occasionally maybe some of the other hands that I didn't put in, such as 6-5 suited, or maybe a king 8 suited, or maybe something from here. So this is the flattening range that I have. And then going to the flop, we see that the strategy for us is to almost pure c-bet. We do see an 11% check back range. So what this means is PIO decides to check back sometimes, and our particular hand, ace-4 of clubs, does also check a whole 6% at a time. But the most important thing here is that for a lot of these hands, the EV of checking and betting is going to be the same, which is very important for when we're considering an exploit. In terms of the stuff that checks back with a more significant weight, it's kind of what you would expect. We're seeing the majority of checkbacks from stuff like queens, jacks, and 10s, which are neither getting called by worse all that often nor getting better to fold. So kind of intuitive checkbacks, I would say. Maybe the only checkback that's not that intuitive that happens at a pretty high frequency is ace king. The reason that ace king is checked back and king queen isn't is because while they have very similar equity, ace king is obviously a little bit better, but since out of position doesn't have ace king in his range, the only difference other than that king queen chops with king queen is that ace king is protected against the ace overcard, which is why despite it having better equity, we don't mind checking it back since we can't get sucked out on by our opponent. And then in terms of how the suits are distributed, looks like we basically prefer to bet when we block the most 9x suited. So the ace-king combos, the diamonds and the spades, which do not block any ace-9 or king-9 suited, which are not already blocked by the board, check back the most. And so, like I said, the most important thing here is that the EV of these mixed hands, even though they're mostly being bet, the EV of checking and betting is going to be the same. So what we want to look at is how PIO reacts to both strategies and how the strategy of our opponents will differ from that. So against bet 30%, we see, I think, a pretty accurate representation of how people are going to play. You know, 7s plus are just going to peel. Then these pocket pairs, I think, do in fact play a mix. I think we occasionally see a fold, but at the same time, people with 6s and 5s, but at the same time, people are kind of aware that they need to be defending enough against a c-bet here and don't want to overfold by a whole lot. So they'll find the call even with these pocket pairs. And then, yes, of course, we'll see some check raising with 9x and with some gutters and some of the, yeah, it looks like PIO likes check raising the ace-queen combos that block all of the queen-9 suited and the ace-9 suited. Probably won't see that, but in terms of the stuff that continues, I think this is pretty close to reality. And so we don't get that much of an edge on a real-life opponent compared to PIO by using this c-bet 30% strategy, since our opponent will probably play very similar to the strategy that PIO is using. Now the time side goes check-check. We see the 2 diamonds on the turn. My argument for why my line is better in practice is because once it goes check-check and our opponent checks to us, we see that, so we do see that PIO bluffs ace-4 every now and again, but it's not really a combo that it uses very often. But we see a very similar strategy to the flop for our opponent on the turn in terms of the hands that continue. And that should be of no surprise, because if the small blind were to start overfolding a lot against the delay c-bet, then PIO would just start using the delay c-bet instead of c-betting on the flop, especially on a board that's relatively static like this one. And so my argument is that we're not going to see these peels from 3s and 4s and 5s and 6s. Maybe it would be a stretch to say never, but certainly not with the frequency that PIO is peeling them with, which is why I think the delay c-bet is so much better than the flop c-bet in this spot, because we're just going to be getting a fold from 6s, 5s, 4s, and 3s very, very often. Might even get a fold from 8s, which are a pure call. Ace-queen might just find the fold right away as well. And then on the blank 3 of clubs river, so we see, obviously we don't get to this node very often. We see quite a bit of mixing of all the bet sizes. It looks like the small bet size is mostly used by queens and jacks, which are still finding a value bet, and some of the weaker king X hands. I think that'll be kind of torching it in real life, because again, I think opponents are generally overfolding, so I'm not sure that I'd be finding this value bet with the queens or jacks. And as far as these 2 bet sizes go, it looks like a lot of hands are just kind of mixing. Well, actually, no, that's not true. They're not mixing both. Aces like to overbet, and King X likes to bet smaller a little bit more often. And that's just because we have the king blocker, so we're blocking the mandatory calls from King X. And so I actually ended up betting a size in between these, since I bet something like 2/3 pot. And the reason that I did it is because I expected my opponent to overfold against a smaller bet. So we don't have the bet size that I used in this sim, but we have this half pot size, and we see that against half pot. We are pretty often getting called by ace queen again, and about half the time getting called by all of these pocket pairs. Now, one caveat here is that my turn assumption was that we don't actually see our opponent get to the river with this much weight of these pocket pairs, which obviously makes him fold a little bit less, which actually makes me like the smaller bet a little bit more, since we're, of course, never getting a fold from King X, but if we see PO's reaction to the pot size bet, we again see a lot of calls, but less calls with the pocket pairs, which I assume that our opponent has less of. So in summary, I would say that my river plays okay. I do think that I should bluff my hand more often than PO does. Well, PO just bluffs ace-4 of clubs and every ace-4 combo on this river. But check sometimes. I think I just have a pure bet since I'm getting a lot more folds than PO is folding on the river. But really the big exploit is right here on the turn, where my argument is that there's just no way that my opponent is going to be defending as much as PO is and just pure calling 8-7s and almost pure calling 6s and getting in there with ace queen sometimes. And the other thing that I wanted to mention too is that on this turn, I think we see a block a little bit more often from a king than what PO is doing. So PO never blocks here and just bets a polarized range, mostly consisting of good King X and then 9X and bluffs. And the way I see a lot of people play this spot is that they do have a bigger bet size, but they also block better, bet smaller with King X quite a bit. So that makes the delay turn c-bet even more appealing, since there will be less of King Queen, King Jack, King 10 in our opponent's range. So something to keep in mind. Really happy with how this hand went, and it's an exploit that I think is kind of theory approved in the sense that we know how PO plays this spot. We see PO take this line sometimes, but not very often. But if we are correct in how our opponents are deviating from PO, then we could take that not so often line and make it a thing very, very often.